In the darkened stalls of the Lyceum, amid thunderous applause for Hamlet's ghost, a single flash lit the private box, and Sir Reginald Haverstock slumped dead with a bullet through his heart. No shot was heard, no pistol was found. His devoted Pomeranian never barked. In the dead man's hand, a torn visiting card bearing the name of his sole heir, who had threatened to kill him hours before. Everyone believes it is murder. Sherlock Holmes knows it is something far more diabolical, because sometimes the most violent outburst makes no sound at all. Chapter 1. The Man Who Arrived Too Late. It was one of those raw, searching nights in November of 1895 when the very air seemed to carry a presentiment of evil. I had spent the earlier part of the evening at my club endeavoring to lose myself in the columns of the Lancet and a glass of indifferent port. But the restlessness that had plagued me all day refused to be laid. Accordingly, I found myself climbing the 17 steps to our old rooms in Baker Street a little before 11 o'clock, my boots leaving damp prints upon the oilcloth, the chill of the fog still clinging to the folds of my Inverness. I opened the door and was greeted by the familiar and, I confess, comforting chaos of our sitting room. Violin upon the table amid a snowstorm of correspondence. The chemical corner still reeking faintly of the abominable compound Holmes had been brewing that morning, and the great man himself half buried in the recesses of his armchair, enveloped in his mouse-colored dressing gown, a pipe clenched between his teeth and his eyes fixed upon the ceiling as though he could read the future in the cracks of the plaster. He did not speak as I entered, nor did I disturb him. I knew the signs too well. Some problem of singular delicacy had engaged that restless brain, and until he chose to unburden himself, I was content to throw off my wet coat, draw my chair nearer to the blazing coal fire, and stretch my legs to the warmth with a sigh of satisfaction. I had scarcely done so when the bell below rang with a violence that startled even Holmes from his reverie. A moment later came the sound of hurried footsteps upon the stairs, and before Mrs. Hudson could announce him, our door burst open to admit a visitor whose appearance struck me with instant concern. He was a young man, tall and well-formed, dressed in the height of fashion, yet every line of his figure spoke of agitation carried almost to the point of collapse. His top hat was crushed in one gloved hand, his fair hair disordered, and his face, normally I should judge handsome and open, was now livid, the eyes starting from their sockets, the lips trembling with some barely mastered emotion. A thin line of blood had trickled from beneath the cuff of his left sleeve and dried upon the whiteness of his cuff. His gloves were torn as though he had clawed at some hard surface in frenzy. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he cried in a voice that shook with the effort to remain coherent, looking wildly from my friend to myself and back again. "Thank God I have found you at last." Holmes had risen in one swift feline movement and now stood regarding the newcomer with that keen, piercing gaze which could read a man's history in the stains upon his boots. "Pray compose yourself, sir," said he quietly, "and be seated. Dr. Watson, the brandy. You have evidently undergone a severe shock." The stranger made a gesture as though to wave aside the decanter I offered, but his hand shook so violently that the spirit splashed upon the table. He drank at a gulp, then sank into the basket chair, pressing both hands to his temples. "My name is Reginald Haverstock," he began, the words tumbling over one another. "Of Haverstock and Sons, the diamond merchants in Hatton Garden. You will have heard of us, perhaps. My uncle, Sir Reginald Haverstock, the head of the firm, has been murdered this very night, shot through the heart in the stalls of the Lyceum Theatre during the third act of Hamlet. And the world, the police, the newspapers, everyone will say that I did it." The stark sentence hung in the air like the tolling of a bell. I felt the old familiar thrill that always came when some new and sinister drama was about to unfold before us. Holmes, who had resumed his seat, leaned forward, his thin, eager face lit with that strange inner fire I had seen so often. "Pray be precise, Mr. Haverstock," said he, with that crisp decision that invariably calmed the most distraught visitor. "You say the world will say you did it. Do you mean that the police already suspect you, or merely that circumstances exist which may lead them to do so?" "They will the instant they learn the facts," replied the young man bitterly. "Not 2 hours ago I quarreled violently with my uncle in the smoking room of the Garrick Club in the hearing of half a dozen members. I accused him of ruining the firm and of blighting my sister's life by his infatuation for a woman none of us have ever seen. I threatened him. God help me, I threatened aloud that I would see him dead before I allowed him to complete the new will he intended to sign tonight. I stormed out of the club in full view of the porter, took a hansom to the Lyceum, where I knew he had taken a private box, and arrived just as the audience was screaming and the curtain falling in disorder. I forced my way to his box. He was slumped forward in his stall, a bullet wound through his heart, and in his dead hand he clutched my visiting card, torn cleanly in two. He buried his face in his hands, and for a moment the only sound was the crackling of the fire and the distant rumble of a late cab in the street below. Holmes's eyes glittered like steel. "And the pistol?" he asked softly. "Vanished. No one saw anything. The house lights were down for the ghost scene. The orchestra was playing fortissimo. There was a single flash in the darkness, then nothing until the gas was turned up and the screams began. By that time the murderer had melted away like smoke." Holmes sprang to his feet with that electric suddenness which told me the chase was already begun in his mind. "Watson, my hat and coat. Mr. Haverstock, you will accompany us to the theater at once. One question only before we leave. Your uncle was a widower, I believe?" "Yes, for many years." "And you are his nearest male relative?" "Jointly with my sister Evelyn. The estates, the business, everything would have come to us. But tonight he intended to sign a new will disinheriting us both in favor of this mysterious woman he proposed to marry within the month. A woman who has never been presented to any member of the family." Holmes rubbed his long, nervous hands together with satisfaction. "Capital. The motive is plain, the opportunity remarkable, and the method apparently impossible. Come, Watson. The game is afoot, and the curtain has scarcely risen upon the first act of a singularly baffling drama." He seized his ear-flapped traveling cap from the mantel and was already halfway down the stairs before our astonished visitor had time to rise. I followed, pulling on my coat as I went, and in another moment the three of us were rattling through the fog-bound streets in a growler, the yellow glare of the gas lamps flickering upon the drawn curtains and the pale, set face of Reginald Haverstock. Never, I think, had I seen Holmes so eager. He sat upon the edge of the seat, his body braced forward, his eyes shining with that uncanny light which told me his brain was already piecing together the scattered fragments of the puzzle. From time to time he shot rapid questions at the young man beside him. Questions about the exact seating in the theater, the nature of the box, the habits of the murdered man, and each answer seemed to afford him intense satisfaction. We reached the Lyceum while the excitement was still at its height. A knot of constables stood at the entrance. The great glass doors were guarded. Within, the auditorium echoed with the confused murmur of many voices. The performance had, of course, been abandoned. Sir Henry Irving himself, still in the black velvet of the Prince of Denmark, was moving among the distressed patrons with words of apology and reassurance. Lestrade met us in the foyer, his little rat eyes gleaming with official importance. "Ah, Mr. Holmes," said he with his characteristic sneer, "I might have known that the impossible would bring you sniffing round before morning." Holmes waved him aside with an impatient gesture and led us straight to the private box in the stalls where the tragedy had occurred. The body had been removed, but the chair in which Sir Reginald had died still stood forward, its crimson cushion bearing a dark and terrible stain. The air was heavy with the smell of blood and candle grease and the lingering perfume of expensive cigars. Holmes was upon his knees in an instant, his lens in his hand, examining every inch of the carpet, the velvet hangings, the brass rail at the front of the box. From time to time, he gave a little chuckle of satisfaction or emitted a low whistle of discovery. I watched him in silence, knowing better than to interrupt the workings of that marvelous brain. At length he rose, dusting the knees of his trousers. "Observe, Watson," said he, pointing to the cushion. "The bullet entered just below the sternum and passed clean through the body. Yet there is no corresponding hole in the back of the chair, nor any mark upon the paneling behind. Curious, is it not?" "Impossible, I should have said," remarked Lestrade, who had followed us in. "Precisely," returned Holmes with a smile. "And yet it has happened. Tell me, Mr. Haverstock, did your uncle carry anything unusual in his pockets? A small bag of jeweler's rouge, perhaps, or polishing sand?" Young Haverstock started violently. "Why, yes. He was never without a little velvet bag of quartz sand. He used it constantly when examining stones, even in the theater or at dinner. Said it helped him judge the water of a diamond by the way the grains clung." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And here," he continued, producing from the folds of the cushion a single object which he held up to the light, "we have something still more suggestive. A lady's glove of mauve silk, delicately perfumed with essence of heliotrope, size 5½ freshly dropped and bearing upon the tip of the middle finger a tiny trace of the same quartz sand. Our unknown fiancé, perhaps." The curtain had indeed risen upon a drama darker and stranger than any that had ever been played upon the stage of the Lyceum, and already, in the flickering gaslight, I seemed to see the shadowy figures of the players moving across the board. Chapter 2. The scene of the outburst. The Lyceum still trembled with the aftermath of tragedy when we stepped from the fog into the warmer, heavier atmosphere of the auditorium, where the gas jets had been turned full upon the gilded balconies and the great chandelier blazed like a captured constellation above a sea of upturned faces. Constables stood at every exit, their bull's-eye lanterns throwing circles of yellow upon the crimson carpet, and the air was thick with the mingled odors of scent, cigar smoke, and the faint, unmistakable iron tang of blood. Sir Henry Irving himself, pale beneath his stage makeup, moved among the lingering patrons with murmured apologies, while stagehands in shirt-sleeves darted to and fro like frightened black beetles. Lestrade conducted us down the central aisle with the air of a man who knows himself master of the situation, yet secretly dreads the moment when that mastery may be challenged. The private box assigned to Sir Reginald Haverstock was situated upon the prompt side, no more than 20 feet from the footlights, its little velvet-hung doorway opening directly upon the stalls. A single constable guarded the entrance, his face wooden beneath the shadow of his helmet. Holmes brushed past him without ceremony and entered the narrow chamber as though it were his own. The dead man's chair still faced the stage. A dark stain had soaked into the crimson plush, and upon the tiny ledge before it lay the crumpled program, the ivory opera glasses, and a pair of gray suede gloves neatly folded, exactly as Sir Reginald must have placed them before the fatal moment. The orchestra pit yawned empty beneath us. The great act drop, painted with a scene of Elsinore by moonlight, hung motionless, and somewhere behind it a stage-hand's hammer rang dismally upon iron. Holmes dropped to his knees with that abrupt, panther-like grace I knew so well, his lens already in his hand. For perhaps 5 minutes he crawled about the carpet like some keen-scented hound, now peering, now sniffing, now passing his long fingers delicately over the pile. Then he rose, measured the depth of the box with a silk tape, examined the brass rail that guarded the front, and finally turned his attention to the velvet cushions themselves. From the folds of the seat he drew forth with a low exclamation of triumph a single object which he held up between finger and thumb. It was a lady's glove of the finest mauve silk, exquisitely small, the palm faintly dusted with minute grains of sharp, crystalline sand. A delicate perfume, heliotrope, unmistakable, rose from it as he held it to the light. "Observe, Watson," said he. "The size, 5½ at most, the quality, the perfume, and above all these grains of quartz. Your uncle's polishing sand, Mr. Haverstock?" The young man nodded dumbly, his eyes fixed upon the glove as though it were a thing alive and venomous. Lestrade gave a sniff of derision. "Some lady visitor, no doubt. Half the West End wears heliotrope this season." "Half the West End does not leave its gloves in the boxes of murdered diamond merchants," returned Holmes dryly. "Note also the 2 fresh scratches upon the brass rail, here and here, as though made by the pressure of a small hard object. A ring, perhaps, or the bezel of a bracelet." He pocketed the glove, then bent again to the carpet. When he straightened, he held between his fingers 3 or 4 grains of the same quartz sand, together with a single thread of mauve silk torn from some heavier fabric. "The box is only 8 feet from front to back," observed Lestrade, "and the door was in full view of 200 people. The shot must have been fired from inside the box at point-blank range." "Must it?" murmured Holmes. "Yet the bullet entered below the sternum and passed clean through the body. Where, then, is the corresponding hole in the chair back? Where the mark upon the paneling? Where, above all, is the bullet itself?" He indicated the wainscoting behind the chair, smooth and unmarked, and the velvet hangings which showed no rent or powder burn. Lestrade opened his mouth and shut it again. For once the little detective was at a loss. Holmes turned to young Haverstock. "Your uncle sat alone?" "Entirely. He disliked company at the theater, said it distracted him from the play." "And the chair beside him, empty?" "Yes." Holmes stepped to the front of the box and gazed out over the auditorium. The house lights were now blazing, every seat was visible, every pillar and balcony picked out in merciless detail. From where we stood, the stage was framed like a picture, the great curtain filling half the field of vision. "During the ghost scene," said Holmes thoughtfully, "the orchestra was at its loudest, the stage almost in darkness, the limelight concentrated upon the battlements. A flash at that moment would be seen by half the house, yet the report might well be swallowed by the trombones. Curious." He leaned far over the rail, his hawk-like profile sharp against the glow of the chandelier, then drew back with a sudden sharp intake of breath. "Watson, the dog!" I stared at him. "What dog?" "Precisely," said he. "Sir Reginald was never without his Pomeranian, a vicious little brute that bit 3 of the Garrick Club waiters last season. The dog always accompanied him to the theater in a small wicker basket and was placed beneath his chair. Yet tonight the basket is absent, and no one has mentioned hearing the creature bark or whimper. Why?" Young Haverstock passed a hand across his forehead. "I had forgotten. The dog detested strangers. It would have flown at any intruder." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Then we have our first solid fact. The person who entered this box, if any person did, was no stranger to the dog. Come, there is nothing more to be learned here tonight. Lestrade, you will preserve the box exactly as it is. Tomorrow we shall call at Hatton Garden. I fancy the diamonds themselves have a tale to tell." As we stepped once more into the fog, the great doors of the Lyceum closed behind us with a hollow boom that sounded in the emptiness of the street, like the closing of a tomb. Chapter 3. The 3 silent witnesses' morning found us in a hansom bowling eastward through a city still half asleep. The fog of the previous night thinned to a pale saffron haze that turned the sun into a copper penny and laid a film of damp upon every railing and windowsill. Holmes sat beside me wrapped in his ulster. His chin sunk upon his breast, his eyes half closed. Yet I knew from the occasional flicker of his nostrils and the restless drumming of his fingers upon his knee that his mind was racing far ahead of the horse's hooves. From time to time he murmured a name or a date, as though testing the links of some invisible chain, and once he startled the driver by leaning forward to cry, "Bear left into the Strand. No, no, the other cab, the four-wheeler with the white scratch upon the near tulle. Door. Follow it." Only when the vehicle in question turned into the courtyard of Charing Cross Station did he sink back with a little sigh of satisfaction. We reached the Lyceum again a little after 9, and the great theatre, so brilliant the night before, now wore the desolate look of all playhouses by daylight. The paint cracked and shabby, the gilding tarnished, the crimson carpet faded to the color of dried blood. A yawning constable admitted us, and we found Lestrade already installed in the stalls with 3 witnesses seated in a solemn row upon the orchestra chairs like unwilling performers waiting for the curtain to rise. Holmes greeted them with that courteous gravity which always put even the most nervous witness at ease, and begged them to recount, each in turn, exactly what they had observed during the 3rd act of the previous evening. First to speak was Lady Basildon, a venerable dowager swathed in black bombazine and a positive fortress of jet beads. She had occupied the box immediately to the right of the murdered man. Her voice, though thin, carried the authority of one who has never in her life been contradicted. "I saw nothing whatsoever, Mr. Holmes. My hearing is not what it was, and the ghost scene always affects my nerves. I was engaged in taking a little sal volatile from my reticule when the disturbance began. By the time I looked up, the gentleman was already dead, poor soul." Holmes bowed. "And you heard no sound of a shot?" "None. Though with the orchestra making that infernal din, I dare say I should not have heard the last trump." He thanked her gravely and turned to the second witness, a tall, bronzed gentleman with a military mustache and the cold, steady eyes of the big game hunter. I recognized him at once. Colonel Sebastian Moran, late of the Indian Army, reputed the second most dangerous man in London, and if rumor spoke truly, the only marksman who might have stood comparison with the late Professor Moriarty himself. Moran's testimony was brief and delivered in a voice of parade-ground crispness. "I occupied the box on the opposite side. My attention was fixed upon the stage. The appearance of the ghost is managed with remarkable skill. I became aware of a flash rather brighter than the limelight, somewhere to my right. I assumed it to be a fault in the electrical apparatus. A moment later, the screaming began. That is all." Holmes regarded him with a curious intentness. "You are a noted shot, Colonel. Did the flash suggest to you the muzzle flare of a pistol?" "It did not. The color was wrong. Too white, too sharp. A pistol gives a yellowish flame." "And you noticed no movement in Sir Reginald's box either before or after?" "None, though my eyes were upon the battlements." Holmes inclined his head, and Moran resumed his seat with the ghost of a smile, as though aware he had just undergone an examination and rather enjoyed it. The third witness was a little, rabbit-faced man with nervous hands and a permanent stoop. The stage doorkeeper Rucastle, who had been on duty in the corridor behind the boxes all evening. "I never left my post, sir, not for a minute," he protested, twisting his cloth cap into a spiral. "No one could have passed me without my seeing. I'd swear to that on a stack of Bibles." Holmes questioned him closely. "Had any person, man, woman, or member of the company, entered or left Sir Reginald's box after the rise of the curtain? Had he noticed any stranger in the corridor? Any smell of powder? Any unusual sound?" To every query Rucastle answered with the same anxious negative, until at last Holmes dismissed him with a friendly nod and turned away, humming softly beneath his breath. When the 3 had been escorted out, Lestrade could contain himself no longer. "Well, Mr. Holmes, what do you make of that little lot?" A deaf old lady, a cool-blooded marksman, and a stage doorkeeper frightened of his own shadow. Not much help there, eh? On the contrary, said Holmes, each has contributed a vital piece to the mosaic. Lady Basildon heard nothing because, in all probability, there was nothing to hear. Colonel Moran's evidence as to the color of the flash is of the highest importance. And Mr. Rucastle, poor fellow, has just told us without realizing it that the murderer never used the door at all. He sprang lightly onto the stage, motioned me to follow, and for the next quarter of an hour we explored the dusty spaces behind the scenery. The flies, the prompt corner, the trap room, the narrow iron stair that led to the great limelight gallery high above the proscenium. Holmes moved like a man who knows exactly what he is seeking, tapping walls, measuring distances, peering through cracks in the act drop. At length he paused beneath the great painted battlement where the ghost had made its appearance the night before and pointed upward to a small, circular opening in the border. "Observe," said he. "This aperture directly overlooks Sir Reginald's box. A thread, a wire, or a tube might be passed through it unseen. And note the fresh scratch upon the iron railing here, exactly the width of a small mirror or reflector." He descended again, rubbing his hands with satisfaction. "Come, Watson, we have done all that is possible here. Let us step round to the Garrick Club and discover exactly what passed between uncle and nephew before the quarrel became public property. And afterwards, yes, afterwards, I fancy a visit to Half Moon Street may be indicated. The scent of heliotrope is still strong upon the air." As we emerged once more into the pale sunlight, I glanced back at the silent theater with its blind windows and remembered how often, in the cases that followed, the most vital witness of all was the one that could neither speak nor move. The empty box itself, with its mute testimony of sand and mauve silk and a dog that, for reasons we were only beginning to comprehend, had not uttered a single bark upon the night its master died. Chapter 4. A Lady in Mauve. The fog had lifted by the time our hansom set us down in Hatton Garden, yet the narrow canyon between the high, grimy buildings still held the chill of night, and the brass plates of the diamond merchants gleamed dully like the eyes of watchful animals. Haverstock and Sons occupied a tall, old-fashioned house with iron bars across the lower windows, and a porter in a faded uniform who peered at us suspiciously until young Haverstock spoke his name. Inside, the atmosphere was that of a chapel suddenly bereaved. Clerks moved on silent feet, ledgers were closed with reverent care, and black crape already draped the portrait of the founder in the entrance hall. Holmes wasted no time on condolences. He demanded the private office of the late Sir Reginald, the strong-room keys, and the ledgers for the past 18 months. While young Haverstock fetched them, my friend prowled the room like a hound quartering new ground. He opened drawers, examined inkwells, ran his finger along the edge of a steel safe, and finally paused before a small wall cabinet containing sample stones laid out on black velvet. He lifted one magnificent diamond to the light, turned it this way and that, then gave a low whistle. "Observe, Watson," said he, holding the stone so that I might see. "A stone of the first water, apparently. Yet look at the girdle through the lens. The facets are slightly blurred, the color a fraction too blue. Paste, my dear fellow, and brilliantly executed paste at that." Young Haverstock entered at that moment carrying a pile of ledgers and stopped dead, the blood draining from his face. "Impossible," he whispered. "That was Uncle's own private tray. He examined every stone himself." "Exactly," returned Holmes grimly. "And someone has been substituting false stones for real ones over a considerable period. A fortune has walked out of this house in the guise of worthless glass. Your uncle discovered the fraud, threatened exposure, and was removed before he could act. That, Mr. Haverstock, is the true motive behind last night's events." He spent the next hour poring over the books while I watched the young man pace the room like a caged creature. At length, Holmes closed the final ledger with a snap that rang through the silent office. "Systematic, patient, and almost perfect," he announced. "The substitutions began 15 months ago and increased in daring. The last entry, 3 weeks since, shows a parcel of stones valued at £47,000 dispatched to Amsterdam for cutting. Those stones never reached their destination. Instead, paste replicas were returned and placed in the vaults. Someone with unrestricted access to both strong room and private office has been at work." He turned to Haverstock. "Your uncle's secretary, Mr. Felix Carver. Where is he?" "Resigned suddenly a fortnight ago. Said his health required a sea voyage. He left for the continent the very day Uncle first spoke of changing his will." Holmes's eyes glittered. "And the lady your uncle intended to marry, her name and direction?" Young Haverstock hesitated, then took a card from his pocketbook. "Miss Violet de Vere, 14B Half Moon Street. Uncle met her 6 months ago at a charity performance. None of the family has ever been presented." Holmes was already reaching for his hat. "Come, Watson, we have kept the lady waiting quite long enough." Half Moon Street, in the cold clarity of a November noon, presented that peculiarly English combination of discreet elegance and faded gentility. Tall houses with whitened steps, curtains of immaculate lace, and here and there a crest upon a carriage door. Number 14B was above a milliner's shop whose window displayed 3 bonnets calculated to ruin any gentleman who attempted to pay for them. A pert maid in a frilled cap answered Holmes's ring, and after a glance at his card admitted us with obvious reluctance. We were shown into a small drawing room furnished with taste and no little luxury. French mirrors, a Sèvres vase filled with forced violets, and upon a lacquer table a silver cigarette box bearing the monogram VD in entwined diamonds. The scent of heliotrope hung heavy in the air. Miss Violet de Vere entered almost immediately, and I confess the sight of her drove every thought of diamonds and murder from my mind for a full 10 seconds. She was perhaps 25, tall, with the kind of beauty that seems to draw all light into itself. Hair of lustrous black, skin like ivory, and eyes of that smoky violet gray which gives the impression of veiled depths. She wore a morning gown of mauve silk which exactly matched the glove we had found, and upon her left hand blazed a solitaire diamond that must have weighed 12 carats at the least. She looked first at young Haverstock, and something, pity, fear, calculation, flickered across her face before she composed it into gentle sorrow. "Reginald," she said softly, "they told me you were taken by the police. I have been in agony." "Not yet, Violet," returned the young man bitterly, "though it is only a question of hours unless Mr. Sherlock Holmes can prove I did not shoot my uncle for your sake." Her eyes turned to Holmes, and I saw them widen a fraction as she recognized the name. Yet she met his gaze steadily. "I loved Sir Reginald," she said with a simplicity that carried conviction. "He was kind when the world had not been kind. We were to have married next month. His death is a grief from which I shall not recover." Holmes regarded her for a long moment, then produced the mauve glove from his pocket and laid it upon the table. "Perhaps, madam, you can explain how this came to be in Sir Reginald's box at the Lyceum last night, bearing traces of jeweler's quartz sand upon the fingers." The color left her face as though a tap had been turned, yet she did not faint or dissemble. Instead, she sank slowly into a chair, her hands clasped in her lap, and when she spoke, her voice was steady. "I was there," she said quietly. "I had promised Sir Reginald I would watch the performance from the circle, but when the interval came, he sent a note begging me to join him in his box for the ghost scene. He was nervous, said the play always affected his heart. I slipped down the side stairs and entered just as the lights were lowered. I stayed only a few minutes. When the flash came and he clutched his chest, I thought at first it was the excitement. Then I saw the blood and I lost my head. I fled by the corridor, leaving my glove behind. I swear I heard no shot, saw no murderer. By the time I reached the street, the police were already arriving. Holmes listened without movement, his eyes never leaving her face. "And afterwards?" he asked softly. "I came home. I have not slept. I feared to go to the police lest they think, as everyone will think, that I profited by his death." Young Haverstock made a strangled sound and turned away. Holmes picked up the glove, turning it thoughtfully in his long fingers. "One more question, Miss DeVere. The diamond upon your finger, may I see it?" She hesitated, then drew it off and handed it to him. Holmes carried it to the window, held it to the light, breathed upon it, and finally applied his lens. "Beautifully cut," he murmured, "and an excellent imitation. The real stone, I fancy, now reposes in some safer hiding place." He returned the ring with a slight bow. "We shall not detain you longer, madam. Pray accept my condolences upon your loss." As we descended the stairs, I could contain myself no longer. "Holmes," I cried, "the woman is either innocent or the most accomplished actress in Europe." My friend's only reply was a thin smile and the murmured words, "The scent of heliotrope, Watson, is very strong upon the stairs. And did you notice the mud upon the hem of her gown? Fresh mud from the embankment, I should say, and splashed no more than 2 hours ago?" He stepped into the street and stood for a moment gazing upward at the drawn blinds of the first-floor window. "A lady in mauve," he said softly, "who visits the river at dawn and wears paste diamonds worth £40,000 upon her finger. The game grows interesting, Watson. Very interesting indeed." Chapter 5. The curious incident of the dog in the nighttime. That evening found Baker Street wrapped in a darkness so complete that the street lamps seemed mere smudges of sulfur in a sea of ink, and the air itself carried the taste of coal smoke and wet iron. I had spent the afternoon at my club, vainly attempting to divert my mind from the Lyceum tragedy. But every newspaper placard screamed the same words: "Diamond merchant shot in theater box. Nephew sought by police." And the faces of my fellow members wore that particular expression of thrilled horror which the English reserve for scandals involving the very rich and the very dead. When I climbed our 17 steps a little before 8, I found Holmes in a state of suppressed excitement which told me the case had taken some fresh and decisive turn. He was pacing the room in his purple dressing gown, the violin under his chin, drawing from it long, mournful notes that seemed to echo the wail of the wind about the eaves. Pipes, books, and maps lay scattered like the debris of a battle, and upon the table stood a small wicker dog basket lined with red flannel. The identical basket, I realized with a start, that should have held Sir Reginald's Pomeranian on the night of the murder. Holmes laid the violin aside the instant I entered. "Watson, you are in time for the most singular revelation of the entire case. Sit down, light your pipe, and give me your undivided attention." He seized the basket and turned it upside down. From the lining fell a little shower of quartz sand, bright and sharp as powdered glass. "This," said he, "was delivered by messenger half an hour ago from the cloakroom at Charing Cross, where it had lain since yesterday morning. The dog itself is at the veterinary surgeon in Great Portland Street, having been found wandering near the embankment at dawn, half-starved and trailing its lead. The porter at the Lyceum swears it was never removed from the theater on the night of the murder. Someone, therefore, took it away afterwards and abandoned it." He paused, watching the effect of his words. "But the importance lies not in the dog's absence, but in its silence. You recall that the Pomeranian was a creature of ferocious temper, ready to fly at any stranger who approached within 5 yards of its master. Yet on the fatal night it uttered not one bark, not one growl, even when, as we must suppose, the murderer entered the box and fired at point-blank range. Why? I confessed myself utterly at a loss. "Because," said Holmes triumphantly, "the person who entered that box was no stranger to the dog. The animal knew its visitor intimately, knew the scent, the voice, the very touch. Therefore the visitor was someone who had fed it, caressed it, taken it upon her lap 100 times. In a word, Watson, the mysterious fiancée herself." He flung himself into his chair and steepled his fingers. Picture the scene. Miss Violet DeVere, having arranged to meet Sir Reginald in his box during the ghost scene, enters quietly, the dog fawning upon her skirts. She sits beside the old man. Perhaps she even holds his hand. Then at the exact moment when the orchestra crashes and the limelight flares upon the battlements, she draws a pistol and fires. The flash is seen, the audience assumes the report is lost in the music, and by the time the gas is turned up, she has slipped away, leaving the dog bewildered but unharmed. The perfect crime, or so she believed. I could not repress a shudder. But the bullet, Holmes? The absence of any wound of exit? He waved the objection aside. Details, merely details. A small caliber weapon, a bullet of soft lead designed to expand on impact. There are such things, though rare. Or perhaps the pistol was never fired at all, and the wound was inflicted by some other means. We shall know when the post-mortem report is complete. The vital point is that the dog recognized its mistress and therefore did not bark. He sprang up again and began pacing with redoubled energy. Everything now fits. The mauve glove with its traces of quartz sand. She had been handling the false stones that very day. The heliotrope perfume lingering in the box. The mud upon her hem this morning. She went to release the dog near the river at dawn, hoping it would be lost forever. Even the torn visiting card in the dead man's hand. She tore it herself to incriminate young Haverstock. He stopped suddenly and smote his forehead. Idiot that I am. The card was torn in two, exactly in two. Yet young Haverstock's cards, as I saw at the Garrick Club, bear his address upon the reverse. Why tear a card in half unless to separate name from address? She wished the police to find the name, but not the address, because the address would have led them straight to Half Moon Street and to her. He seized his hat and coat. Come, Watson, we must confirm the post-mortem at once. If I am right, the bullet will prove to be of foreign manufacture, Belgian perhaps, or Austrian, and the wound will show powder burning at close range. And tomorrow we shall pay another call upon the lady in mauve, this time with Lestrade and a warrant. We were at the door when the bell rang sharply below. Mrs. Hudson's voice floated up the stair, followed by hurried footsteps. A moment later, the door burst open to admit young Haverstock, hatless, his face livid with terror. "Mr. Holmes," he gasped. "They have found the pistol in my desk at Hatton Garden, wrapped in a mauve silk scarf and bearing my fingerprints. Lestrade is below with half Scotland Yard. They mean to arrest me tonight." Holmes's eyes blazed with that fierce joy I had seen so often when the hunt reached its climax. "Capital!" he cried. "The lady grows desperate. She has overplayed her hand. Quick, Mr. Haverstock, into my bedroom and lock the door. Watson, the revolver from the drawer. We shall receive the inspector ourselves." He pushed the young man into the inner room, closed the door, and turned to me with a smile that was almost boyish. "Now, Watson, we shall see whether the dog that did not bark in the night-time can be made to speak in the morning. The game is at its most delicate stage, and I fancy the next move belongs to the lady in mauve." Chapter 6. The Railway Timetable. Dawn had scarcely begun to pale the fog when Holmes shook me awake with the curt announcement that we were leaving for the continent within the hour. He was already dressed for travel, ulster buttoned to the throat, ear-flapped cap pulled low, a Gladstone bag at his feet, and upon the table lay 2 first-class tickets for the Ostend boat train, a Bradshaw open at the Continental Supplement, and a small pile of Belgian and French currency which he was counting with the rapidity of a bank teller. I had long ceased to be astonished at these sudden eruptions of activity. I merely threw on clothes, swallowed the coffee Mrs. Hudson pressed upon me, and followed him into the raw morning. A 4-wheeler bore us swiftly to Charing Cross, where the Continental platform already steamed and hissed like some iron dragon. Holmes purchased a sheaf of newspapers, thrust one into my hand, and then stood motionless amid the bustle, his eyes fixed upon the departures board with that peculiar intensity which told me he was seeing far beyond the printed times and destinations. At the last moment he seized my arm and propelled me into a first-class compartment just as the guard's whistle shrilled. Only when the train was clear of the station and the fog of London had given place to the bleak Kentish fields did he speak. "The lady has fled, Watson. She sailed on the night packet from Dover to Ostend at 11:30. I have wired ahead. She will be detained at the customs shed. But the man interests me more. Felix Carver, late secretary to Sir Reginald Haverstock, traveling as Mr. Charles Vernon and wife. They booked through to Vienna, but they will not reach it." He spread Bradshaw across his knee and ran a long finger down the columns. "Observe the beauty of the timetable. The mail boat leaves Dover at 11:15 p.m., arrives Ostend 3:30 a.m. The connecting express for Vienna via Brussels and Cologne departs Ostend Quay at 4:05 a.m. 25 minutes to clear customs, purchase tickets, and board. A close connection, yet perfectly possible for travelers who know the routine. But mark this. The same boat carries a local service to Bruges, Ghent, and Brussels, which departs at 4:20. If our birds miss the Vienna express by even 5 minutes, they must wait until the evening. I have arranged that they shall miss it." He leaned back with the satisfied air of a chess player who has just announced mate in 3. "But the dog, Holmes, how does the dog fit into a railway timetable?" He smiled. "The dog is the whole timetable. The Pomeranian was found on the embankment at 6 yesterday morning, half a mile from Miss de Vere's flat. She released it at dawn, having kept it hidden overnight. Why? Because the dog knew her, would have betrayed her presence in the theater by joyous recognition instead of silence. She dared not kill it. Sir Reginald doted on the creature, so she imprisoned it until she could set it loose far from Half Moon Street. But the dog had been fed daily by Carver as well as by the lady. Its basket still carries the faint odor of the Russian cigarettes he affected. When Carver resigned, the dog pined. When he returned secretly to the theater on the night of the murder, to assist in the substitution of the final parcel of stones, the dog greeted him with delight, and therefore did not bark when he entered the box. I was struggling to absorb this when Holmes continued. The murder itself was simplicity. Carver concealed himself in the empty box opposite, armed not with a pistol but with a small limelight reflector, borrowed from the theater's own stores. At the exact moment the ghost appeared, he flashed a concentrated beam straight into Sir Reginald's eyes. The old man, already nervous, suffered a fatal seizure of the heart. Miss de Vere, seated beside him, pressed the torn visiting card into his hand, scattered quartz sand from her glove to suggest robbery, and slipped away. No shot was fired. The flash was nothing more than calcium light reflected from a mirror. The absence of bullet, exit wound, and powder burn all become clear. He folded Bradshaw with a snap. The pistol found in young Haverstock's desk was a clumsy afterthought, planted yesterday when the lady realized we were closing in. The mauve scarf was her own. The fingerprints were impressed while Haverstock lay drugged. A simple matter for a woman who had once been on the stage and knew the use of chloroform. The train rushed onward through the pale morning. At Dover, the sea lay flat and dull as pewter beneath a sky of oyster gray. We boarded the packet with a handful of muffled travelers and stood at the rail while the white cliffs receded. Holmes was silent, his eyes fixed upon the horizon, but I could feel the coiled spring tension in him. At Ostend, the customs shed was cold and echoing. Two Belgian policemen stood beside a pile of luggage, and near them, pale but composed, stood Miss Violet de Vere in a traveling cloak of dark green velvet. Beside her, trying to appear unconcerned, was a tall, thin man with a fair mustache and the stooping shoulders of the habitual desk worker, Felix Carver beyond doubt. Holmes stepped forward. "Miss de Vere, I believe you have something belonging to Messrs. Haverstock and Sons. A parcel of diamonds, perhaps?" Her eyes met his for a long moment, then the mask dropped. She gave a little shrug, almost of admiration. "You are very clever, Mr. Holmes. Too clever, perhaps, for England. The stones are in the false bottom of that portmanteau. We meant to start anew in Vienna, a city where a beautiful woman and £40,000 may still buy happiness." Carver started to protest, but a gesture from the Belgian officer silenced him. Holmes turned to me as the prisoners were led away. "And that, Watson, is the curious incident of the dog in the night-time. It did nothing, that was the curious incident, because the criminals were its oldest friends." He glanced at the timetable in his hand and smiled. "Come. The Vienna Express leaves in 7 minutes, and there is an excellent restaurant car. We have earned our breakfast, I think, and young Haverstock has earned his freedom." As the train pulled out of Ostend, the morning sun at last broke through the clouds, striking golden fire from the windows of the carriages and turning the sea to a sheet of glittering diamonds, real ones this time, and honestly come by. Chapter 7. Ashes and Diamonds. The return from Ostend was made in a curiously subdued triumph, for the case, to all appearance, was closed. The thieves taken with the jewels in their possession. The murder weapon proved never to have been fired. Young Haverstock's name cleared in every newspaper from the Morning Post to the Police Gazette. Yet when we stepped from the boat train at Charing Cross late that same evening, Holmes was silent and preoccupied, his eyes fixed upon some inner vision that I could not share. He dismissed the cheering reporters with a curt gesture, thrust a telegram into young Haverstock's hand announcing that the charges were withdrawn, and bundled me into a hansom with the single word, Baker Street. The moment our sitting-room door had closed behind us, he flung hat and coat upon the sofa, tore open the dispatch box, and began pulling out papers with feverish haste. The acid-stained deal table was soon littered with maps of London, tide tables, chemical apparatus, and half a dozen dog-eared volumes on precious stones. He filled his oldest briar with the strongest shag, lit it from the spirit lamp, and began pacing the room in great strides while the smoke rose about him in blue strata. I watched him for a full 10 minutes before I ventured to speak. "Holmes, the case is over. Why this restlessness? The woman has confessed to the fraud. The diamonds are recovered. The murder turns out to be no murder at all. What more can you ask?" He stopped in mid-stride and fixed me with a gaze so fierce that I almost recoiled. "Watson, Watson, you see, but you do not observe. The case is not closed, it has merely entered its most dangerous phase. The confession at Ostend was too pat, too convenient. Violet de Vere is clever enough to know that a partial confession is the best shield against a greater charge. She admitted the theft of the diamonds, yes, but she still swears that Sir Reginald died of heart failure brought on by the limelight flash. That is the one point upon which she will not yield, and it is the one point upon which everything hangs." He swept a pile of newspapers from the chair and sat down opposite me. "Consider the inconsistencies. The post-mortem, which I have just obtained from Lestrade, shows a bullet wound, small, clean, and unquestionably the cause of death. A .32 caliber rimfire cartridge, soft lead, slightly mushroomed, lodged against the spine. Yet no pistol capable of firing it was found in the theater, and the weapon discovered in Haverstock's desk is a .38 Webley. Utterly different. Where then is the real pistol? And how was it? Discharged without sound, without smoke, without the dog barking. He sprang up again and began turning the pages of a small black notebook. Again, the quartz sand upon the mauve glove and upon the carpet was mixed with minute particles of crushed heliotrope petals. Fresh petals, Watson, not perfume. Someone had ground the flowers into the sand deliberately. Why? And why was the dog's basket found in the cloakroom at Charing Cross with a false bottom containing a second parcel of diamonds, stones that were not on the list recovered at Ostend? Someone planned a second escape, a second deception. He seized a railway timetable and flung it open. Listen to this. The night packet from Dover to Ostend sails at 11:15. The last train from Charing Cross that connects with it leaves at 8:40 p.m. But there is a later train, the theater train as it is called, which reaches Dover Pier at 11:05, in time for passengers who have attended the evening performance. It is reserved almost entirely for actors, stagehands, and theater folk. A woman in stage makeup carrying a portmanteau would pass unnoticed among them. Violet de Vere was once an actress. She knows the routine perfectly. I began to see the direction of his thought. You believe she never intended to remain on the continent? Exactly. The arrest at Ostend was part of the plan. A feigned flight, a confession to theft, and then, when suspicion has died down, a quiet return to England to collect the second parcel of stones. But there is a third player in the game, Watson, someone we have overlooked, someone who knew every detail of the plan, who planted the Webley in Haverstock's desk, who scattered the heliotrope sand as a signature, who still holds the real pistol. He crossed to the fireplace and began burning papers one by one in the grate. Old memoranda, lists of figures, a photograph of a woman in theatrical costume. The flames leapt up, casting weird shadows across his gaunt face. Notice the ash, he said, poking the glowing fragments. This is Bedford tobacco ash, light fluffy with a distinctive gray flake. Felix Carver smoked Russian cigarettes. Violet de Vere used only Turkish. But there is one man connected with the case who invariably smokes Bedfords, Colonel Sebastian Moran. A cold thrill ran through me. Moran, but he was in the box opposite, a mere spectator. Was he? A man who can drop a tiger at 400 yards with his own rifle could certainly drop a diamond merchant at 20 feet with an air cane. The von Herder air rifle, silent, smokeless, deadly, was Moriarty's favorite weapon. Moran inherited it. A slug from that rifle would make a wound indistinguishable from a soft lead bullet at close range. The flash we all saw was the limelight reflector operated by Carver. The actual killing was done by Moran from the opposite box at the exact same instant. The dog did not bark because it never saw the danger. He turned from the fire, his eyes blazing. The trio planned it together. Carver substituted the stones, Violet supplied the paste and the distraction of the engagement. Moran provided the perfect murder weapon. When Sir Reginald discovered the fraud, they decided he must die in public with young Haverstock accused. The flight to Ostend was to give Moran time to dispose of the air cane and collect his share. But I have been one move ahead. The second parcel of diamonds is now in Lestrade's hands, and Moran believes it still lies in the cloakroom basket. He took his revolver from the drawer and slipped it into his pocket. Tonight he will come here. He must come to recover the map I purposely left among the ashes showing the supposed hiding place of a third cache. When he does, Watson, we shall have the last act of our little drama. He moved to the window and stood looking down into the street. The fog is rising again, a perfect night for tigers. And as I followed his gaze, I saw across the road beneath the dripping lamp The tall figure of a man in an astrakhan coat, the red tip of a Bedford cigarette glowing like a vigilant eye in the darkness. Chapter 8. The Second Outburst. The hours that followed were among the most tense I have ever spent beneath our Baker Street roof. Holmes had extinguished every lamp save the small green-shaded reading light above the table so that the room lay in a half-darkness broken only by the dull glow of the fire and the occasional red pulse of his pipe. He himself sat motionless in the basket chair, the revolver across his knee, his eyes fixed upon the door with that still, unwinking concentration I had seen in a Burmese tiger watching a tethered goat. I had taken up my old station behind the curtain at the bow window, my service revolver loaded and my heart beating a good deal faster than I cared to admit. The fog outside had thickened until the street was no more than a tunnel of swirling yellow, and the lamp opposite our door showed only as a dim halo in the gloom. From time to time a cab splashed past or a late wayfarer hurried by with coat collar turned up. But for the most part Baker Street lay as silent as a country churchyard. The clock upon the mantel had just chimed the half hour after 1 when Holmes raised a warning finger. A footstep, slow, deliberate, almost noiseless, sounded upon the stair. It paused upon the landing, then came on again, and there came a soft scratching at the panels as though someone were trying the lock with a pick. Holmes's lips shaped the word Moran, and he rose silently to his feet. The door opened without a sound. Whoever had entered had oiled the hinges, and the tall figure of Colonel Sebastian Moran slipped into the room. He wore a long ulster with the collar turned high and carried a small black bag in his left hand. In his right, something glinted, the short, deadly barrel of the Von Herder air rifle. The firelight caught the cruel hawk face, the cold eyes, the bristling military mustache. He stood for a moment listening, then moved with the silence of a stalking leopard toward the table where the ashes still glowed faintly in the grate. Holmes stepped from the shadow. "Good evening, Colonel Moran. You are somewhat late for a social call." The colonel whirled like a cat, the air cane raised, but the click of my revolver from the window and the gleam of Holmes's weapon in the firelight froze him into immobility. "Drop it," said Holmes quietly. "The rifle is an admirable weapon, but it is useless at 3 paces against 2 revolvers." Moran's lips drew back in a snarl, but the cane clattered to the floor. In the same instant the door burst open and Lestrade, with 2 constables, sprang into the room. Holmes had arranged the signal earlier. The colonel was seized and handcuffed before he could make another movement. "You have been busy, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade, rubbing his hands. "We have been watching the house since midnight on your message. But how did you know he would come tonight?" "Because," replied Holmes, "the second outburst was always part of the plan. The murder in the theater was the first. The attempted murder of young Haverstock last night was the second. The third would have been the murder of myself, the only man who could still connect the trio. Moran intended to silence me, recover the map from the ashes, and vanish with the final parcel of stones. Instead, he will hang at Newgate, and the Von Herder rifle will find a permanent home in Scotland Yard's Black Museum." He turned to the prisoner. "You made only one mistake, Colonel. You scattered heliotrope petals in the quartz sand, the signature of Violet de Vere, to throw suspicion upon her when the time came to sacrifice her. But the petals were fresh from the hothouse at Portland Place, and the only man with a key to that hothouse is yourself. You betrayed your hand the moment you left your visiting card, so to speak, in the sand." Moran's face was a mask of fury, but beneath it I saw the pallor of the trapped beast. "You are the devil himself, Holmes," he said hoarsely. "Moriarty warned me you were dangerous." "And he was right," returned Holmes calmly. "Take him away, Lestrade. The fog is lifting and London will breathe more freely without its second most dangerous man." When the room was quiet again, Holmes sank into his chair, lit his pipe afresh, and gazed long into the dying fire. "The chain is complete, Watson. The first outburst, the murder in the theater, was to remove Sir Reginald and incriminate the nephew. The second, the attack on young Haverstock, was to strengthen the case against him when the pistol was planted. The third, my own removal, was to close the circle. But the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime was the clue that led us through the maze. The dog knew all three conspirators: Carver, who fed it; Violet, who caressed it; Moran, who bribed the servants to let him play with it in the garden. It did not bark because it had no warning of danger. The death came silently from across the auditorium. He rose and stretched his long limbs. "Come, Watson. The night is far spent, and tomorrow we must attend the inquest. The jury will bring in willful murder against Moran, manslaughter against Carver and the woman, and young Haverstock will inherit the business after all. The diamonds, real and paste, will be sorted at Hatton Garden, and the Haverstock family will learn that even the most violent outburst may be no more than the cracking of a mirror that has long been flawed." He moved to the window and drew back the curtain. The fog was indeed thinning. A watery moon showed the wet pavements gleaming like mother of pearl, and somewhere a church clock struck the quarter. "London sleeps again," said he softly, "and the tigers are caged. Let us follow the city's example, old friend. Tomorrow the world will read of the Lyceum tragedy solved, but tonight there is only the quiet ticking of the clock and the knowledge that justice, though slow, is sure." And with that he threw himself upon the sofa, pulled his dressing gown about him, and in 5 minutes was sleeping as peacefully as a child, while I sat beside the dying fire and watched the first pale heralds of the dawn creep across the sky. Chapter 9. The mirror cracked. The inquest upon Sir Reginald Haverstock opened at 10 o'clock on a morning so bright and cold that the very air seemed to ring like glass, and the coroner's court in the Marylebone Road was already packed with journalists, diamond merchants, and half the idle curiosity of London. Young Haverstock sat pale but composed between his sister and his solicitor, while in the dock Violet de Vere, heavily veiled, kept her lovely face turned away from the public gaze, and Felix Carver stared at the floor as though he could see his future written there in the dust. Colonel Moran alone met the stares of the crowd with the icy contempt of a man who has faced worse than English justice on a dozen frontiers. Holmes had refused to give evidence until the final day, and when at last he stepped into the witness box, the hush was absolute. He spoke quietly, without theatrics, yet every word fell into that crowded room like a pebble into still water. "The mirror," he began, "and one was the key all along." He held up a small square hand mirror of polished steel, the twin of the one found among the limelight apparatus at the Lyceum. On the night of the murder, Mr. Felix Carver, concealed in the empty box opposite Sir Reginald, waited until the ghost of Hamlet's father appeared upon the battlements. At that precise instant, the great calcium limelight was trained full upon the figure of the ghost. Mr. Carver angled this mirror so that the beam was reflected directly into Sir Reginald's eyes. The old gentleman, already in a highly nervous state, suffered a violent shock to the system. His heart faltered. He clutched at his chest and fell forward. At the same moment, Colonel Moran, seated in the box to the left, raised the von Herder air rifle, a weapon capable of propelling a soft lead slug with no more sound than a man's breath, and fired once across the auditorium. The slug entered just below the sternum, passed through the body, and buried itself in the padding of the chair, where it was later recovered by Dr. Watson and myself. The flash of the reflected limelight was seen by half the house. The report of the air rifle was lost among the trombones of the orchestra. The dog beneath the chair, accustomed to all three conspirators, did not bark. The perfect illusion of a pistol murder at close range was complete. A murmur swept the court. Violet de Vere's veil trembled, Carver's head jerked up as though he had been struck. Holmes continued, calm and merciless. Miss de Vere, seated beside the dying man, performed the final offices. She pressed young Haverstock's torn visiting card into the slack hand, the address half torn away so that no suspicion should fall upon her own door. She scattered jeweler's quartz sand mixed with crushed heliotrope petals. Her signature, she believed, but in reality the signature of Colonel Moran, who alone had access to Sir Reginald's hothouse. She then slipped from the box, leaving her glove behind as seeming proof that the mysterious fiancé had been present at the tragedy. The subsequent events, the planting of the Webley revolver, the attempted murder of young Haverstock, the feigned flight to Ostend, were all designed to strengthen the case against the nephew and to give Moran time to dispose of the air rifle and collect the final parcel of stones. But the mirror had cracked, gentlemen. The reflection of guilt showed too clearly. He laid the little steel mirror upon the ledge of the witness box. It caught the cold sunlight and flung a trembling sword of light across the ceiling. "Notice the flaw," he said softly. "A hairline fracture running from corner to corner. That fracture occurred when the mirror was dropped in haste upon the stone floor of the limelight gallery. It is the exact shape and length of the scratch we found upon the iron railing behind the ghost battlement. The mirror cracked from side to side. The curse, as the poet has it, was come upon them all." He stepped down amid a storm of excitement which the coroner's hammer could scarcely quell. The jury retired for only 7 minutes. When they returned, their verdict was willful murder against Sebastian Moran, felony murder against Violet de Vere and Felix Carver, and a rider commending Mr. Sherlock Holmes for his extraordinary services to justice. Outside in the corridor, young Haverstock seized Holmes's hand with tears in his eyes. "You have given me back my life, sir. The business, the name. Everything is safe." Holmes disengaged himself gently. "The business will prosper the better for honest management," said he. "As for the name, guard it well. There is no curse upon the Haverstock save the curse that falls upon any house where greed is stronger than affection." Violet de Vere was led past us at that moment, the veil thrown back now, her beauty undimmed by defeat. She paused and looked full at Holmes. "You are a devil, Mr. Holmes," she said, and there was almost admiration in her voice, "but a just one." "Madam," he replied with a slight bow, "the devil is always just. It is men who are sometimes merciful." Moran followed between two warders, his head high, the old tiger unrepentant to the last. As he passed, he bent his head toward Holmes and spoke in a voice only we could hear. "Moriarty's revenge, Holmes. You may cage the tiger, but the jungle remembers." Holmes met his gaze without flinching. "Then let the jungle remember this also, Colonel. The law of the wild is tooth and claw, but the law of England is proof and patience. Good day." The great doors swung shut behind the prisoners, and the bright winter sunlight poured into the corridor like cleansing water after a storm. Holmes drew a long breath and turned to me with something of his old lightness. "Come, Watson, the mirror is whole again. Let us find a hansom and a steak and kidney pudding. Even the pursuit of justice must pause for luncheon, and I confess that the smell of the Marylebone Road is less agreeable than that of Simpson's." And so we left the court, the little steel mirror safe in his pocket, its crack no longer a flaw but the visible signature of truth, the thin bright line where illusion shattered and the clear light of reason shone through. Chapter 10. The deduction in the drawing room. A week later, upon a frost-bright December afternoon when the sky over Portland Place hung like polished steel and every window pane in the great Haverstock mansion flashed back the winter sun, the final scene of our drama was played, not in the gaunt severity of a courtroom, but in the crimson and gold drawing-room where Sir Reginald had once held court among his diamonds and his dreams. The heavy curtains were drawn back, the chandeliers blazed, and a coal fire roared in the atom grate, as though determined to banish the last shadow of the tragedy. They were all assembled as for a tableau, young Reginald Haverstock and his sister Evelyn upon the sofa, pale but composed, Lestrade trying unsuccessfully to look at ease in a Louis XV chair, 2 Scotland Yard constables by the door, Violet de Vere, veil discarded now, seated beside her counsel with the calm of one who has already looked into the abyss, Felix Carver, hollow-eyed and twitching in the custody of a warder, and in the place of honor before the fireplace, Colonel Sebastian Moran, wrists in steel but shoulders squared, the old soldier refusing to the last to bow beneath defeat. Holmes stood with his back to the fire, thin, eager, and vibrantly alive, the light catching the steel of his eyes and the hawk-like outline of his profile. He waited until the silence became almost painful, then spoke in that quiet, penetrating voice which could still every room. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are met today not to reopen wounds, but to close them forever. The law has spoken. The guilty have been judged. Yet one thread remains to be tied, one picture to be completed, so that the innocent may walk into the future without the burden of doubt." He turned first to young Haverstock. "You, sir, were the intended scapegoat from the beginning. Your quarrel at the Garrick Club was overheard and noted. Your visiting card was torn in 2 so that the name might condemn while the address protected the true criminal. The pistol planted in your desk, the mauve scarf, the staged attack upon your person, all were designed to drive the noose tighter. You have suffered much, but you emerge with clean hands and I trust a wiser heart." He inclined his head to Evelyn Haverstock, who pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. "To you, Miss Haverstock, falls the heavier task, to rebuild a great house upon the ruins of greed. Diamonds are cold things. Let warmth and honesty be the new setting." Lestrade shifted uncomfortably, but Holmes's gaze passed to the prisoners. "Miss de Vere, you conceived the fraud. For 18 months you replaced stone after stone with paste so skillfully cut that only the lens of suspicion could detect the deceit. You used beauty as a weapon and love as a cloak. Yet when Sir Reginald discovered the theft and threatened exposure, you did not strike the fatal blow. That was reserved for another." Violet de Vere lifted her head. For the first time the mask slipped, and I saw the weariness beneath the bravura. "I loved him once," she said simply, "in my fashion." "Mr. Carver," continued Holmes, "you were the patient spider at the center of the web. You kept the books, you made the substitutions, you arranged the false shipments to Amsterdam. You resigned at the precise moment when discovery impended, intending to vanish with the spoils. But you, too, were only the instrument." Carver muttered something inaudible and stared at the carpet. Holmes turned at last to the tall figure of the colonel. "Sebastian Moran, you were the marksman. The von Herder air rifle, silent, smokeless, invisible, was your contribution to the conspiracy. From the opposite box you sent the soft lead slug across the auditorium at the exact instant Carver's mirror flashed the limelight into the victim's eyes. The flash explained the light. The orchestra covered the absence of sound. The dog, knowing all 3 of you, remained quiet beneath the chair. It was a plan worthy of the late Professor Moriarty himself, and you executed it with all the precision of the soldier you once were." Moran's lips curled in a wintry smile. "You give me too much credit, Mr. Holmes, and too little. I have killed bigger game than an old diamond merchant and for less reward." "Yet you will hang for it," returned Holmes quietly, "and the jungle will have one tiger fewer." He stepped forward and placed upon the marble mantel the little cracked steel mirror that had been the turning point of the case. "Here is the true weapon, not the air rifle, not the limelight, but this simple reflector. It caught the light of truth and flung it back into darkened eyes. Sir Reginald died of heart failure induced by shock, yes, but the shock was doubled by the silent bullet that followed a heartbeat later. The mirror cracked from side to side. The curse came upon the house because 3 greedy souls believed that wealth was worth more than life. He looked slowly round the room, letting the silence settle again. There is, however, one final piece of evidence which has not yet been made public. From his pocket he drew a single quartz grain, no larger than a pinhead, yet sparkling with malevolent brilliance in the chandelier light. This was found embedded in the wound itself. Quartz sand does not fly through the air of its own accord. It was carried upon the soft lead slug, forced into the sand by the rifling of the air cane, and driven deep into the flesh. It bears, under the microscope, the faint imprint of a crushed heliotrope petal, Moran's signature left in contempt, as the big game hunter leaves his card upon the tiger's carcass. Moran's face did not change, but something deadly flickered in his eyes. Holmes replaced the grain in its tiny envelope. The chain is complete. The law will do its office. But let us remember, all of us, that the most violent outburst is often no more than the cracking of a mirror long distorted by falsehood. When truth at last strikes full upon it, the glass shatters and the fragments cut the hand that held it. He turned to young Haverstock and extended his hand. "Your house is clean again, sir. Walk in it with honor." The young man grasped the offered hand with both of his, unable to speak. Lestrade rose, signaling to the constables. "Come along, you 3, the van's outside." As the prisoners filed out, Violet de Vere last, pausing for one backward glance of infinite regret, Holmes moved to the window and stood looking down into the glittering winter street. Outside, the frost sparkled on the area railings, and a crossing sweeper's broom scratched cheerfully upon the pavement. London went about its business, indifferent to the passions that had flared and died within these walls. Holmes spoke without turning. "Another page in the book of life, Watson. Greed, vanity, and the lust for power. 3 poisons that turn even the sweetest wine to vinegar. Yet justice has its own quiet luster, and truth, like the diamond itself, endures after the setting has crumbled." He drew the curtain across the window, shutting out the bright, cold day. "Come. There is a hansom at the door, and Mrs. Hudson will have kept the chops hot. The game is over, the board cleared, and tomorrow, who knows, another problem will present itself. Until then, let us be content with the warmth of our own fireside and the knowledge that, for one family at least, the mirror is whole again." And so we left the great house in Portland Place, the echo of our footsteps dying along the marble corridor, while behind us the fire settled in the grate and the winter sun, striking through the high windows, scattered 1,000 harmless diamonds of light across the floor where guilt had stood only moments before.